There's a room in a museum in Lower Saxony, Germany, where scientists spent the better part of 5 decades being deeply professionally confused. Not the fun kind of confused. The kind where you look at evidence, look at your textbooks, look at the evidence again, and then quietly start questioning everything you thought you knew about the species you study. The object causing this confusion doesn't look like much. A wooden shaft, roughly 2 meters long, slightly tapered at both ends, carved from spruce. If you saw it leaning against a wall at a hardware store, you'd walk right past it. But this thing was pulled out of a waterlogged sediment layer in an open-cast coal mine in northern Germany. And the layer it came from was dated to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. That alone is remarkable. Wood almost never survives that long. It disintegrates. It becomes soil. The only reason this one made it to us, and the 9 others found alongside it, is that they were buried in ancient lakeshore sediment, sealed in a kind of anaerobic time capsule before microbes could get to them. But the age wasn't even the part that confused everyone. It was the design. Because when the researchers started running measurements on the spear, and this was eventually confirmed through biomechanical modeling, they realized it wasn't just a stick someone had sharpened. The thing was engineered. The thickest point of the shaft, where most of the wood mass was concentrated, sat in the front third of the spear's total length. Not the middle, not the back, the front third. You know what else is built that way? Modern Olympic javelins. Regulation tournament javelins, designed by aerospace engineers in the 20th century to travel as far and as accurately as possible, use that exact weight distribution to optimize flight. The center of gravity in the front, creating stability, reducing wobble, maximizing distance, and impact on target. These ancient humans, whoever made these, had figured that out. Without aerodynamic equations, without any formal engineering, without access to a single physics textbook. Replicas were later tested by skilled javelin athletes. They could hit targets accurately at up to 20 meters with enough force to bring down large game. 20 meters. That's the distance between you and something dangerous that can't reach you. And that's when the uncomfortable question surfaced, the one that sat in the back of every researcher's mind for 50 years. Why did they need to be able to throw that far? Now, imagine you are not in a museum in Lower Saxony. Imagine you're standing on the edge of a shallow lake somewhere in what is now northern Germany, roughly 200,000 years ago. It's cold. Not apocalyptically cold, but a steady, bone-settling cold that's been here for weeks. The scrub forest around you smells like wet bark and something else. Something muskier and harder to place. Animal. And close. You are not particularly impressive on the biological scorecard. You have no claws. Your top running speed in a flat sprint would lose a race to most things currently sharing this landscape. Your night vision is, charitably speaking, terrible. You weigh maybe 60 kilograms. The horse you're trying to approach weighs 10 times that. The saber-toothed cat that's been tracking the same herd for the past 2 days? It weighs twice what you do and can close 30 meters in about 2 seconds. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual situation. Here's what archaeology tells us about the lake at Schöningen. Around the area where these spears were buried, researchers also found the butchered bones of at least 50 horses. Equus mosbachensis, a large extinct horse species. The cut marks are there, systematic and deliberate. This wasn't casual opportunistic scavenging off a carcass someone else left behind. These horses were hunted, in significant numbers, at a single location, 50 horses, organized, coordinated, sustained. This changes the story. This isn't a desperate, hungry individual poking at prey with a stick. This is a group with a plan. A group sophisticated enough to run an operation that ended with the butchering of 50 large animals in one spot. And the spears, light enough to throw, aerodynamically stable enough to fly true, lethal enough to wound from 15 or 20 meters out, that's the technology that made it possible. You don't need to get close enough for the horse to kick you. You don't need to wrestle it. You don't need to wait for it to be weak and dying from something else. You stand at a distance, you throw, and the math does the rest. I find it genuinely strange that this wasn't our assumption from the start. Somewhere in the cultural shorthand of how we picture early humans, we decided they were always at the mercy of everything bigger than them. Reactive, desperate, cowering. The Schöningen spears say something completely different. They say these people had already figured out how to make their biology irrelevant to the outcome. But here's the thing. The spears explain the horses. They don't explain everything. Because when paleontologists started cataloging hominin bone sites from this period, they found something that initially made no sense at all. Evidence that our ancestors weren't just hunting. They were doing something a lot stranger, a lot more aggressive. They were stealing, not from each other, from the things that were supposed to be eating them. The behavior has a technical name in the scientific literature: confrontational scavenging, or kleptoparasitism if you want to make it sound even more alarming than it already is. And the evidence for it, in butchery marks, in site patterns, in comparative bone analysis, has been building for decades. Here's what it looks like in the archaeological record. You find a concentration of large animal bones. The bones belong to prey that had clearly been killed by a large predator. The initial bite and fracture patterns match what felines and hyenas do when they make a kill. But then, on top of those carnivore marks, you find human cut marks on the prime meat-bearing parts, on sections that a predator eating normally would have consumed first, which means the humans were getting there before the predator finished eating. Sit with that for a second. In this period, the landscape around human groups was shared with Homo therium, a genus of saber-toothed cat roughly the size of a modern lion, with massive upper canines and forelimbs that were proportionally stronger than a lion's, with giant hyenas, with cave bears that stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with a full roster of megafauna that had spent millions of years evolving specifically to kill things. And there's evidence that early humans were walking up to active kill sites, making a lot of noise, throwing rocks and sticks, and driving those predators off their own meals. Researchers who study modern foragers and primate behavior have been trying to understand the mechanics of this. Computer simulations of early Pleistocene food availability suggest that confrontational scavenging was a viable strategy, but only under specific conditions. The group had to be large enough, coordinated enough, loud enough, aggressive enough to make the math work for the predator, to make it cheaper to walk away than to fight. Because a saber-toothed cat defending a kill it already made is not a timid animal. You are not sneaking up on it. You are walking toward it. Deliberately, with intent. And somehow it worked often enough that it became a strategy. A practiced, repeatable, apparently teachable strategy. I keep trying to put myself in that situation and I cannot make the numbers add up in my favor. I struggle with confrontation at the grocery store when someone's in the express lane with too many items. The idea of walking toward a saber-toothed cat that's actively eating something and making myself the most annoying possible presence in its vicinity it's not a thing I'd survive. I'd like to think I'd be the guy coordinating from a safe distance. I would very much not be the guy in front, but someone was in front. Every time. And this is where the story takes the turn that researchers spent the longest time fitting into the bigger picture. Because confrontational scavenging explains how you steal a carcass in daylight, it doesn't explain how you survive the night. Nighttime in this period was a fundamentally different operating environment. No fire guaranteed, no permanent shelter, low visibility. The predators that owned the dark, Homo therium was a daytime hunter, but leopards and other large cats are most active from dusk onward, had every physiological advantage. Better eyes, better ears. The ability to wait patiently in the dark until something edible presented itself. A sleeping group of humans without any early warning system was essentially a snack opportunity. And this is where paleontologists and geneticists started working from different angles and arriving at the same strange intersection. The genetic evidence for early domestic dogs, the divergence point where ancient wolf populations began the long, messy process of becoming a fundamentally different animal, has been dated and redated and argued over for decades. The current reasonable consensus puts the earliest stages of this process at somewhere between 15,000 and possibly 40,000 years ago, with behavioral mutualism between wolves and humans likely predating formal domestication by a significant margin. What does behavioral mutualism mean in practice? It means that long before anyone was selectively breeding anything, wolves and human groups had figured out that being near each other was mutually beneficial. The wolves got access to food, scraps, processed refuse, the parts of a carcass that humans couldn't or didn't eat. The humans got something that their biology had absolutely no way to provide for itself: a perimeter alarm. A wolf's sense of smell operates at a level that is genuinely difficult to conceptualize from the inside of a human nervous system. They can detect scents at concentrations roughly 100,000 times lower than humans can perceive. They can process directional information from smell in a way that gives them something close to a spatial map of who's been where and how recently. Their hearing is tuned to frequencies and distances that no hominin can access without technology. At night, camped in a landscape shared with predators, a wolf group on the perimeter of a human camp was a living early warning system that ran continuously, didn't require fire or tools, and would start making enough noise to wake the entire group at the first sign of a large predator approaching. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer communities who keep dogs have documented this function explicitly. The dogs alert. The camp responds. The predator, now facing a group that's awake and aware and organized, reconsiders. It's not a coincidence that the earliest undisputed evidence of dogs intentionally buried with humans, the Bonn Oberkassel site in Germany, dated to roughly 1400 years ago, shows an elderly dog that had clearly been cared for through a serious illness. Someone fed this animal when it couldn't feed itself. Someone kept it alive past the point where it could provide any immediate practical return, just to keep it alive. That's not utility. That's attachment. That's a relationship that had been running long enough to generate something that looks a lot like grief. The wolf didn't become a dog because humans captured something wild and bent it to their will. The wolf became a dog because two species operating in the same dangerous landscape gradually figured out that proximity was survival. And at some point, the math had been running long enough that it turned into something else. Here's what I want you to actually think about, putting all three pieces together. The spear technology eliminates your need to be physically close to the thing trying to kill you. The confrontational scavenging tells you that these groups weren't just defending. They were actively competing. Aggressively, against apex predators in their prime hunting mode. The canid mutualism extends your perceptual range and your defensive radius into the dark, into the hours when your biology leaves you most vulnerable. None of these things in isolation is enough. In isolation, a spear doesn't help you when a predator gets inside that 20-meter margin before you've even seen it. In isolation, confrontational scavenging works only in daylight with a large, coordinated group. In isolation, a few wolves on the perimeter alert you. But if you're not already awake and already organized, the alert isn't worth much. Together you've got something that functions like a layered defense system. Reach, aggression, information. And the strangest part is that no single human sat down and designed this. There was no strategy meeting, no whiteboard, no systems engineer connecting the dots. This emerged from thousands of generations of trial and error in an environment where the error term frequently involved not surviving to have children. The things that worked got passed down. In practice, in behavior, in the animals you kept near your camp, in the spear-making techniques you taught your kids by showing them, in the group habits that got reinforced because the groups that had them were still alive to reinforce them. And here's the part of this story that I find almost unreasonably mind-bending. That layered system, reach, aggression, information, is still basically the military doctrine of every modern army on the planet. Standoff weapons, offensive posture, intelligence, and early warning networks. We spent several 100,000 years figuring this out with wood, rocks, and wolves, and then we spent the rest of human history building fancier versions of the same three ideas. The Schöningen spears are sitting in a museum in Lower Saxony, and they look like old sticks. But what they represent is the oldest evidence of a species that refused to stay in its assigned lane in the food chain. These were not the bottom of the predator hierarchy, desperately hoping not to be noticed. These were something new. Something that had decided at some point in the deep past that the optimal response to being smaller and slower and less deadly than everything else was not to hide. It was to reorganize the situation until the math changed. Here's what that means for you, right now, in the body you currently inhabit. The startle response you have when something moves suddenly in your peripheral vision. The one that wakes you up from dead sleep because a sound didn't fit the pattern. That's not a quirk. That's an alarm system that ran continuously for 200,000 years before anyone invented a door lock. The instinct to move toward potential threats as a group rather than scatter, the thing that makes you and 3 total strangers all stop and look in the same direction when something strange happens in a public space. That's coordination behavior. The same coordination behavior that let a group of people walk toward a saber-toothed cat and make enough collective noise and confusion to drive it off a kill. The fact that the dog sleeping next to you on the couch is doing approximately nothing useful right now is, in some sense, a function of how thoroughly your species solved the problem the dog was originally hired to help with. The predator problem is solved. The wolf got promoted to companion animal. Your current relationship with your dog is the epilogue of a 15,000-year partnership that started because the alternative was getting eaten in the dark. I find it genuinely moving that this is where we came from. Not just the intelligence, not just the technology, the specific combination of aggression and cooperation, and the willingness to walk toward the thing that was supposed to be eating you and make yourself the loudest, most annoying possible presence until the situation resolved in your favor. That's in the DNA. All of it. So here's what I actually want to know from you. If you were in that situation, cold, no technology, predators running the night, which part of this system do you think you personally would have contributed to? Are you the person who figures out the spear aerodynamics after watching 100 throws go wrong? Are you the confrontational scavenger who just walks toward the saber-tooth? Are you the one who noticed that the wolves hanging around camp weren't actually a threat and maybe started leaving food closer to them on purpose? Put it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious, because the answer probably says something real about the personality type you actually are, not the personality type you think you are when the stakes are low. If this hit the way it hit me, the idea that we are, in some measurable biological sense, the descendants of the specific individuals who chose to walk toward the danger rather than away from it. Give this a like. It costs you nothing, and it is comparatively the least confrontational thing a human has done all week. Subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to keep going down this particular rabbit hole, because the more you look at the early archaeological record, the more you realize that almost everything we think of as a modern human achievement, strategy, alliance building, systems thinking, was already running, fully operational, in a body that was scrappier and less equipped than we like to imagine. The oldest known weapons in the world are sitting in a museum in northern Germany, shaped like javelins, and the people who made them were already at that moment playing a completely different game than everything else on the landscape. Not because they were stronger, because they refused to accept the terms of the original deal.